If you've seen Dune and didn't quite like it, here's 8 possible reasons why. Number 1, it's old, and in the current cinematic landscape, it feels outdated. Number 2, it's part 1, which means it has no payoff, no catharsis, no real third act. It's all set up, no payoff. To quote Jeremy Jans, it gives you cinematic blue balls. Number 3, it lends itself better to a series. For all its runtime, it felt like we barely scratched the surface of the worlds, houses, and characters. Despite that, it didn't feel boring or drawn out, which must mean that A, what's there needed to be there, and B, what isn't there desperately needed in episodic format in order to be fleshed out. For instance, you mostly feel bad for Jason Momoa's character, spoiler alert, dying because he's played by Jason Momoa and not because you spent enough time to get attached to his character. Number 4, the nature of the One Archetype. If you felt like Timothée Chalamet's Paul Atreides was bland, uncompelling, and one-dimensional, that's got a lot to do with the archetype that he's portraying. Compare him with a more modern version of himself, namely Neo from The Matrix. Neo's beloved and all, and I like Keanu, but much like Paul before him, Neo is very bare bones character-wise. He's got a very basic personality, and that's because he needs to be this way. He needs to go from beat to beat and push the story forward and fulfill his obligations as both protagonist and savior. This is the problem with one character, is they're surrogates for the audience, shells for them to inhabit and live the story vicariously through them. They're avatars, nothing more or less sophisticated than the player character of an RPG. However, in RPGs you can make branching choices that gradually retroactively define your personality. In a movie you can't do that, so the player character has to remain as neutral and thus stale as possible. And it's worth noting here that Harry Potter and Luke Skywalker are both better, more evolved examples of the One Archetype because they're more than just avatars. Their writers conjure up more clearly defined personalities for them, replete with specific traits. But even in these cases, the traits have to be generic enough so that the audience near universally identifies with them: bravery, impatience, recklessness, compassion, etc. As soon as you go deeper with it, the character in question ceases to be a The One character. Jack Sparrow is the most prominent character in Curse of the Black Pearl, yet he's so radically different from what both a chosen one and a protagonist is supposed to conventionally be that another character was written in to better fill those shoes. Jack is manipulative, inconsistent, and borderline callous at times. He has specific quirks, and there's nothing wrong with having all that stuff. It helps tremendously to flesh out his character, but it also prevents the audience from inhabiting that character, from relating to the character. Everyone looks at and reacts to and talks about Jack Sparrow as if he were a real distinct person, but everyone imagines themselves as being Neo, Luke, or Paul Atreides. And that, coupled with Chandrela's mopey, moody mannerisms, makes you take him a bit less seriously as a character. Number 5, nothing is leveraged. By that, I mean that, again, because it's part 1 and because it's not a series, the movie doesn't take advantage of all the things that it establishes. The Atreides come from a water planet and settle on a desert planet. There's an obvious dichotomy there, but we never see the Atreides being particularly affected by the desert environment or having to adapt to it in a meaningful way. Maybe they're saving that for part 2. Pretty hard, since most of them are dead. Similarly, I'm left wondering if more great houses appear in the novel because there's a lot of potential for interplay between them, but obviously we don't have time for that. Zendaya basically stares at the camera a lot in slow motion. That's her role in part 1. Her script must literally read stare, stare intently, and of course turn and stare. And I find it amusing that they've already licensed a fucking Fortnite character after her despite her not doing anything in the film. Oh look, we can now play as Zendaya, that chick who looks really good in the movie. Number 6, Marvel. If you're a skinny, cropped, smart, trousers-wearing Gen Z type, you probably don't even remember a time when the MCU didn't exist, and trees and raccoons weren't a meme. If a movie's 2 hours or longer today, it's either brave or people complain about it. Bitch, 2 hours was the norm back then. Back then, films were a slower-paced, introspective, pensively pretentious pudding of personality, and they didn't feel the need to cram jokes or explosions every 5 seconds for fear that the audience would stop watching, because they didn't stop watching because there was nothing else to watch. Nowadays, if a movie is just a movie without also being a stand-up routine or a demolition zone, it sticks out like a sore thumb, like it's the only employee that wore a sweater to work while everyone else is wearing a notch lapel suit. Number 7, source material. Now, I haven't read the novel, but I keep hearing how the director was over-faithful to it, and I definitely got a sense of that while watching this. Now, it's admittedly hard to straddle the line between taking a piece of fiction from fucking antiquity and spicing it up a little for its own good, and throwing spinners, spoilers, neon lights, and decals with the word family on them, but it does seem like we could have taken a slightly bigger risk here. It could be that many of the aspects of the book don't translate that well on the big screen, for as we know, all the internal monologuing and introspection that sometimes spans entire chapters is relegated to a facial expression or a couple frames of CGI on film. I suppose you could have a narrator like in Fight Club, but they probably didn't want to do that because it would have raised the pretentiousness meter another 400%. And number 8, overhyped reviews. You may have noticed that most of the internet is collectively licking Dune's ass right now, which further enlarges the gulf between what you hear and what you see. And part of why the reviewers hype this movie up so much is because they really want to see part 2. I myself have said this in my review. And while some might genuinely think that the movie's all that, and others might do it because they've been fans of the novel ever since before they could wipe their own asses, the truth is you can't review a part 1 of a movie. It's an incomplete work. Every single bit of payoff and catharsis is locked off behind a curtain that may or may not ever pull back. You can't judge a book by its cover, but you certainly can't judge after reading half of it either. And I expect that both I and other reviewers will retroactively change our opinions about the first part for better or worse once the second part comes out. This isn't like watching The Matrix and then watching The Matrix Reloaded after that. It's like watching Neo watching Morpheus get captured and then taking 2 fucking years to go rescue him and then die.